We made this.
Just take a look at my life now. Take a look at my dreams. Look up to the sky now. It's not what it seems.
Hello and welcome everyone to Pick Up a Podcast, the podcast about podcasters and podcasting. My name is Kurt North and I need to welcome to the show Victor Gamboa. Victor, how are you doing, mate? How are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Kurt. Thanks for having me on, man.
Do you want to give us a brief overview of what your podcast is and how your podcast has developed and that kind of thing, just to give the audience to get a brief insight into what you do?
Basically, the show is just me going episode by episode through the original run of The Outer Limits. And, well, it's basically a show that doesn't get enough love. I mean, and mostly I came to find out later on that, and I mentioned this in my first episode, that I'm seeing a lot of these episodes for the first time, with the exception of a few from season 1, which I wish I would have disclosed more on in the first episode. But basically, it's just me discovering The Outer Limits and appreciating the heritage it has, and kind of giving it a spotlight that I feel like it doesn't get because, you know, the Twilight Zone takes most of that attention. Yeah. So just because something doesn't have as much attention as the other doesn't mean it's not significant or important. So my whole goal with the show is kind of to shed a light on that and to maybe expose others to it, you know, opens people's doors and kind of maybe open their mind to giving it a shot.
Yeah.
So that was like the initial spark, you know.
Okay, so I mean, the obvious thing is the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. I mean, I think your podcast is actually on a podcast which also features the Twilight Zone. Is that right? And how did the idea for your podcast first come about? How did the idea and thought of, I need to do a podcast about this? Where did that come from?
Well, it's kind of funny. I first discovered like podcasts, like I got serious about listening to podcasts like in a time where I was in like a really negative headspace, you know, like I kind of like my mother had just passed away, and so I was just kind of like shut in. And to use a Millennium example, I was looking for my yellow house, you know, the place where everything is zen and everything is like the peace and the chaos. And so I retreated to old TV that I used to love. Through that, I found that listening to people talking about shows that I loved is a good way to like just, you know, to calm. It's like comfort food, you know. It's like hanging out with friends, but like when you're not feeling good and up to going out. So through that, I discovered the Twilight Zone podcast, which is hosted by Tom Elliott. And this is like he had just first started the show. I think it was like 2011. And then so I followed him for a while, and then I reached out and I sent him an email every now and then saying how much like I appreciated the show. And then so fast forward a few more years, a friend of mine, actually a coworker at the time, he was telling me he had just joined a podcast called Everything Comes Back to 2000 AD podcast, which is a comic book, obviously, over there in Britain. Yeah. And so I'm a big 2000 AD fan, so I kind of was trying to pick his brain, like, oh wow, suddenly podcasting didn't seem so impenetrable an idea to get into. So basically, I was picking his brain a little bit about how to go about setting up a podcast. And so I just figured I would, you know, just use what I had, you know, an iPhone mic, like the headphone mic and everything, and how hard could it be to do a voice note and upload it to anything, you know, so very bare bones. And then so Tom Elliott at that time had started posting a show called Gore Boy Radio, which was done by one of his friends, Chris Clayton. And then so that show really resonated with me. I thought that Chris was like a really cool guy, and like his style of hosting was something that I thought that I would probably try to emulate. And so I was like, okay. And it's a shame that they're not online anymore. I wish they were, because I found them so influential. And so I reached out I found that Chris was a nice enough guy to where if I reached out and asked him for any advice, he wouldn't like tell me to bug off or anything, you know. Yeah. So and sure enough, he was super receptive, and he gave me all these tips. He recommended a microphone, which I'm using now, and
and you'll see that the one that I've got here, because we're video calling today, it's exactly the same one. It's a Blue Yeti. So.
Exactly. You can't go wrong, man. It's the most trusted name in podcasting, in my opinion. And so And so he told me, he was like, hey man, you're going to put your best foot forward. You don't want to, come out with some, like cheap sounding audio and stuff. And he was totally right. So he made me rethink everything. And then so he was kind of like, hey, we're just out of curiosity. What are you thinking about doing? And so, like I said, my love is television, and in particularly anthology television. I like that. So I was thinking, maybe I wanted to do a Millennium podcast, but at that time, the Back to Frank Black was going on, and then I just was just like, you know what, maybe I'll kind of wait on that. And I wanted to do Twilight Zone too, but then I thought, well, how do you compete with Tom Elliott's podcast? And then at that time, I think there was like 3 other podcasts that had just popped up, and so I was like, okay, well, and so I told Chris, I said maybe The Outer Limits, or maybe Tales from the Crypt, and so he's like, okay, no problem. And then so he's like, yeah, let me know when you got your first thing done. And so I sent him when I published the little preview episode, I guess he sent it to Tom, or he told Tom, because shortly thereafter, a few days later, I got an email from Tom, and he was just saying like, hey man, you want to join this thing I'm doing? You want to join the website? And I was certainly not expecting that right out the gate.
Okay, and when was that? Was that recently? When you actually joined to that website?
I want to say it was 2017, I believe, maybe 16 or 17. I'm a little iffy on the time frame because there was a lot going on at that time in my life, but I'm pretty certain saying it was 2017.
Okay, so you've mentioned a couple of times with like sort of Millennium, Tales of the Crypts, and the kind of anthology stuff that is kind of like that genre type TV something that you're interested as well with the Millennium, they're obviously dealing with evil aspects, as you know, that I run a Millennium podcast, and is that the type of TV that you would enjoy, the likes of Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, and Millennium? I think I've seen on there that you're a bit of a Twin Peaks fan as well. Is that the shows that you definitely go for?
Oh yeah, I like the darker, more like weirder television. Like definitely, like Millennium was right up my alley when it first came out, and I missed it during its initial run. Like I remember seeing the pilot episode and I was blown away by that because of like how dark it was, and so yeah, definitely. Like as I got older, I definitely appreciate more of the darker TV, and then in terms of anthology, I feel like you learn more from anthology. I feel like you take more away from anthology more than you do with like episodic television. Where it's like with the overarching thing. It's kind of like having like a series finale every week, So it's like, it's great.
It's like running almost like a fable or a short story every week, isn't it? There's always a story behind the reason why that episode is telling you something. So
absolutely,
yeah. So your podcast is a podcast that you do on your own, and you obviously bring in a lot of clips and you do quite a lot of narration over the top of it. How do you find that? And was that because of the gentleman that you talked about before? Was that the style that he did? And is that kind of what you wanted to do? And how do you bring those clips and stuff in? How do you how do you plan for an episode with that type of thing? Do you write a script or do you actually just go off the cuff? How does that all come together?
Well, Chris Clayton, I believe, he made it seem like he was off the cuff, and so I was trying to go off the cuff at first, but I found that there was a lot of like dead space, a lot of ums and uhs, and so and
the fear of everyone.
absolutely, and so I found that it would be easier to just kind of write out what I'm going to say, and then also I feel like it's better that way because when I script out the episode, like. If I do like an off the cuff thing, like maybe later on I'll realize, I could have mentioned this or I could have mentioned that, and so we got to go back and maybe put it in, and then hope the edit isn't all choppy. But this way, when I go into an episode, like the first thing I do is I'll watch it, let it work its magic, as Tom would say, and then jot down any notes, like any impressions or things I want to mention, like that's cool. And then what I like to do is, as I rewatch it, I try to find like an emotional aspect of it that resonates with me, that I feel I can kind of hone in on. Be it like, the relationship between these two people, or like, I noticed that this is about one thing, like, it's about love, but at the same time, if you really focus on this one aspect, it's about loss. And so I focus on like the loss aspect, because obviously like I mentioned earlier, I kind of relate to that. So I kind of go into that. And then In terms of as far as the whole narration part goes, when I came into the podcast, what I wanted to do, like I said, I wanted to like kind of open the doors for people to watch it. And then granted it's streaming on Amazon and Hulu and stuff, but then I realized like, well, some of these people don't have it. And so I found myself just kind of narrating what's happening to kind of bring them up to speed between clips. You know, some people are good enough where they can kind of fill in the gaps and kind of talk without, narrating exactly what's going on. I haven't reached that level yet. So in the it's kind of at a necessity, I'll mention what's going on and then I'll find like, okay, this is a good spot. I'll throw a clip in. And then when I first started, I would just kind of set the microphone next to the TV and then record and then stop it and then kind of adjust it later on. And then Tom again like kind of chimed in and he was just like, hey man, here's some tips. He smartened me up to some software that where you can rip audio. So I was able to do that, and it's so much easier. You just click and drop, and then adjust levels, and that's pretty much it. And it's been a godsend, especially when it comes to like the background music and everything, because you can do whatever you want.
So you mentioned the software there. I mean, what software is it that you use for the clips to rip the audio from?
I think it's called MakeMV.
MakeMV.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
There you go.
I'm totally aware of that. Yeah.
A lot of my software is all like UK based because it's all recommendations from Tom and Chris. So like
right.
Audacity, I believe, is UK based, right? I think.
I'm
not sure, but
I'm not sure actually.
But yeah, a lot of that things like MakeMV and audio and those things are like, that's like the difference between like a good sounding and an awkward sounding podcast, in my opinion. It's
going back to what you said about the way that you put the clips in, and it because your episodes generally go in linear fashion, don't they? So they go from the start right through to the end. And while you're discussing themes, do you ever go off topic and have a bit more detail on particularly, say, for example, you're talking about loss there, like you've said, you've had personal loss there. Do you ever bring that kind of influence into your podcast at all?
I do. I mean, not often. Like I do it kind of where I feel like it fits. For instance, there's an episode called "The Man Who Was Never Born" about the gist of it is a guy goes back in time to try to kill a person who's responsible for the end of the world, essentially.
Right.
So you deal with like changing the future, and so I kind of went on about like, oh, what can I change? Like there's like again, not to bring everybody down, but like I was involved in an accident as a kid that kind of changed me. You can kind of see. I brought that up, and I was kind of like, I kind of wish, but then at the same time, would I be the person I am today? I kind of go off topic there, but that's one instance. And then, I bring up my mom a few times in a few other episodes, but kind of the whole thing isn't really me, like, although sometimes I feel like it is kind of me, like, going through therapy through the Outer Limits,
Yeah.
But I mean, that's just good television in general. But yeah, it comes up, and not always, but I feel like I don't feel the need to hide it or anything. Or I mean, if some people kind of relate to it, if not, then they can just skip ahead 15 seconds.
Yeah, there's always that button. But yeah, I mean, the Outer Limits, as I say, it's one of those ones where I think everyone will know. There's the 90s version as well. Have you gone through for those seasons? Not on your podcast, but generally as a show that you would watch. And how do you feel that they relate to like the older 60s version?
Well, the thing is, like, that was my introduction to the series. I had seen the 90s revival way before I even saw the original. So like a few episodes that I remember. Oh man, it's been so long, but I definitely remember iRobot, which is a remake of there's an episode in season 2 of the original called iRobot with Leonard Nimoy in it. So that one really like stuck with me. So I remember that. And we would watch it every other Sunday. We would go to like my grandmother's house, and so while they're all doing stuff there, me and my sister would kind of sit down and watch the broadcast version of the Outer Limits, edited for TV, of course. But so we will watch that, and then later on, I realized like, dude, this is a remake of an old show, and so I couldn't find it anywhere because this is like it wasn't like I guess the DVDs were out of print or something. But I stumbled across season 1, volume 1 of the original run.
Right.
So I grabbed that and I watched that, and I was like, dude, this is like way more interesting than I thought it was gonna be. And then that was like the end of it for a few years until, like I said, later on, I was kind of like, let's dust this off and take a look, shall we?
I remember watching The Outer Limits, the 90s one, when it was on TV. I thought it's similar to what you're saying. I remember it, but I don't remember it in such a way that I could recall instant things with it. And, being 90s, The X-Files was a big show for me. It's one of my favourite TV shows, as well as likes of Star Trek and Millennium, for example. Those are my three big ones, really. Twin Peaks has come later in my life, which has always been nice to go back and watch that with new eyes. Really, it's nice to see something 90s television with new eyes, especially the revival. But the Outer Limits doesn't have the prestige of the Twilight Zone. But you do mention that there's similarities. There's an episode, I think it was the Doomsday one, where you relate it to another Twilight Zone episode. And also, I think iRobot, was there a narration, or there was some reading through script or something like that was done, or is that on the Twilight podcast?
Yeah, actually, Tom Elliott I think it's on his Patreon. He did he read the short story. The original short story was based on a while ago. He read it by, I think it's Yano Binder. So he read that. And there's actually two parts. For the second part, I've yet to kind of have that in my back pocket in case I run long on another episode. So, he read the short story that appeared in the magazine, and then so I remembered that because he put that out a number of years ago. So I was kind of running late on an episode coming out, and I was like, oh man, I want to put something out, So I kind of reached out and I was like, hey Tom, can I use that file? And he said, sure man, go for it. So he saved the day on that one.
You mentioned about running late there. I mean, how do you go about organising yourself to record the podcast themselves? It is just yourself, so you've got the time that you need to do that. But how do you kind of process that? How does that all come together? You mentioned about watching the episode and writing your script and stuff. But when it comes to coming up to recording it, how does that all occur? And how do you put that together?
It used to be a lot easier actually, because we recently recently as like a year ago, we had a daughter. So now everything is based on like, when's her nap time? When does everybody go to bed? So, and then on top of that, I work. So I do a lot of lunchtime viewings, like on my Twitter over like, hey, I'm sitting down for lunch. Let me chip away at this episode. So I'll usually watch the episode at night on a day off once everyone's gone to bed, which is kind of cool given the vibe of the show. It's like 2:00 in the morning and I'm watching The Outer Limits. Yeah. So I'll do that. And then I usually start preparing right after like I drop an episode. Like if I'm recording, or once I finish recording, I'll have the next episode kind of in the background as I'm editing, just to kind of get that's what I have to expect. And then once that's done, I'll start my write up on it. I'll write out my script, or my thoughts, and then I'll get all the technical aspects out of the way, like, hey, first broadcast, blah blah blah, starring the major players, what they appeared in, and that'll just kind of be there. And then I'll fill it out with my usual thing later on. One thing they don't teach you, or there's no one thing you're not prepared for when you start podcasting is the overwhelming imposter syndrome you have. Sometimes you're like, dude, especially in this case because there was no other Outer Limits podcast, and so I'm like, dude, if I have to hit the ground running, if it sucks, I mean, if you're like the 10th Outer Limits podcast and you suck, whatever. But if you're the only one, so many people have in their mind what they want to hear, and so yeah, luckily I have the Outer Limits Companion by David J. Scow, so I kind of knew going in I had to invest in it, so I had to get the book that's out of print now, and I had to get the CD, also out of print, music of the series. So I went into all that before I even got started.
So you mentioned about sort of your recording. So when you record it and then you start editing, you've got the TV in the background, you're watching the next episode. How long do you generally spend on the edit itself? How long does that normally take you?
The edit, I think I've got down to a science now. Like before, it used to take a long.
I'm glad you have. I'm glad you have because I haven't.
Well, that being said, it just meaning I got it down to like 1 day's worth of editing instead of like 2 days. Where I'm like, I still, it's not my favorite thing to do. But if you're looking to get into podcasts, folks, like beware, like the edit, you gotta. But it's one of the most rewarding things too. Like when you hear it and it's all done, it's incredible. It's one thing that surprised me. It was like, I have 45 minutes of audio recorded, and then after the edit, you're like, I have 15 minutes of audio recorded. But yeah, like I said, with the Make MKV thing, it made life a lot easier. And then, so I'll have that ready to go as I'm editing. So once I finish recording, I'll go through and I'll just kind of like, if I mess up and if I make a mistake during the podcast, I'll kind of clear my throat. Or just so I get like a big wave in the audio wave,
right,
of my recording software, so you can visually see where there's going to be an edit later. Right, so I'll just kind of So I'll repeat a line. If I mumble that, I'll just kind of cough and then do that. And so when I see it in the edit, I'll just kind of highlight, back up a little bit, play it, make sure I have the right thing, chop it out, make sure the levels are okay, and then good. One of the things too, you got to kind of keep in mind for all you would-be podcasters out there when you're just starting, or that is like, I used to edit too tightly, so it didn't sound like natural conversation. It would just sound like a robot talking, or like you're playing it at double the speed.
Yeah,
it's like just
clipping kind of clips it, so you're not leaving any spaces like for the natural breath and things like that. Is that what
exactly?
Saying?
Yeah, like does this person ever breathe? So I think I'm pretty good now. I can kind of find like the edits harder to notice these days, so it's kind of cool. But yeah, that's pretty much what I do when I edit. I add the music. I used to add the music last. I used to do everything one step at a time, but now I add the music as I'm chopping my vocals, and then the clips come last.
Right. Okay. So, and do you do everything actually in Audacity itself then? So you add in the all the tracks in Audacity and edit from there. Is that how you do it?
That's exactly how I do it. Yeah, I have like 4 tracks open for like one for the intro, one for the theme, and then like I said, music and so forth. So everything is done through Audacity just to make things a little easier on myself.
Have you ever struggled with any particular episodes that you've been recording? Has any been any struggles that you've had to overcome with episodes in particular, or have they all been pretty smooth?
Yeah, they've been pretty smooth. One of the major hiccups was in terms of like proper episodes. When you come across one, it's a fan favorite. Like the first time I did one was like, I think it was the Sixth Finger. It has a good following, and it's a cult classic, or a classic of the series. So going into it, I was so nervous. I'm like, what do I say about this? And so it took me a while to even get started, because I was just thinking, like, is this going to be good? It goes back to the Imposter Syndrome. Like, who am I to talk about this episode? I'm just a guy in his kitchen. At the time, by the way, you can see I'm in a bedroom now, but at the time I was hunched over a kitchen counter talking to a microphone, begging for my dog to stop barking, as I mentioned on Twitter recently. But yeah, so I just decided, like, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Venture forth, say how I feel about it. This is like early days in the podcast. So yeah, but I found the hardest thing for me in the show, and it's a little easier now, but initially it's like you said, like dealing with guests, not dealing with, but asking, like speaking with guests. Yeah. So like my third podcast was an interview with an author of an Outer Limits music book, Reba Wisner. And thankfully she was such a nice person, because that thing it's unlistenable, man. So like on my end, like God bless her, man. She did her best to like she kept it together, and I just basically ended up re-recording my end because there was like audio stuff going on, and then me just kind of being nervous, and yeah. So that was like the hardest episode to do, was the very first interview so early on. Yeah.
Have you had many guests on over the episodes that you've had then, or do you envisage trying to get hold of people?
I see myself doing that more. I've had her back on since then, and it was a lot easier. And then I had one more guest on. His name is Craig Beam. He has a Twilight Zone podcast, and as well he has a blog about the Outer Limits. So I had him on, and it was really good. And I hope to have him back on when I do the season 1 finale. That's kind of my plan, hopefully. So I'll extend the invite.
Where are you in at the moment with? So you mentioned about season 1. Are you getting to the end of season 1? Are you going to be taking a break at any point, or are you just going to roll straight into the next season? How's it all going to roll for you?
Right now, I'm a little more than halfway through the first season. So, and I'm just going to keep going, to be honest. I feel like my episodes take a lot longer than they should to come out. So I feel like if I take a break, it would just, like, this show's been out for almost I think this is my 3rd year, and I'm still in season 1. So
right, yeah,
I feel like if I take a break, it'd be like a 10-year mission to finish season 1 or to finish the series. Yeah, right now I think there's about 25 episodes in there, and I'm about at episode 19, I think.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm almost there. I'm looking forward to it. It's like I said, I have this idea I want to do for the finale. I'm kind of similar to what Tom did with his, but with an Outer Limits twist and maybe a guest. So that'd be kind of cool.
How often does your podcast come out then? Is it just when it's ready, or do you have a set period of time where you have it out in due ready for a particular date or week or whatever?
Well, my goal is to have it out monthly. There was a time where, monthly is good. I feel like that's enough time to get everything down and edited, and I feel like if anything less than that would kind of be a rush job, and that would kind of just bug me when listening back to it during the edit, it could have been a lot better. But sometimes it takes about 2 months, which is not often, but it happens. Life gets in the way, so. But for the most part, I'd say about monthly is a good release schedule for me.
Oh, good. Okay. So, it's nice to have your own level, because obviously with the shows that I do, we've had a bit of a 3-month gap. And it is, as you say, life gets in the way. I'm trying to juggle about 4 podcasts. I don't know why I do it to myself. I really don't. But anytime anyone says, even if it's a guest, he'd come on and say, would you like to come and guest on this show? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And then realise I haven't watched that TV show for 6 years. I need to watch it. And then you've got to find the time and things like that to get back into
definitely.
it. But yeah, so having your own schedule, I think, is quite nice. And monthly, it's probably enough for people to remember to keep you subscribed as well, which is quite good. And as you say, if you're continuing through, then that would be great. So how many seasons does the original Outer Limits have then? How many is it in total?
Only 2.
Only the 2.
To be honest, yeah,
right.
Only the 2. So
is that one a 25 episode one as well?
I feel like there's less. I don't have a definite episode count, but it's definitely less than season 1. So that's the thing with this podcast. It has a finite end date, and so I'm still kind of toying with the idea of jumping over to the revival series afterwards.
Right.
So I might have to just kind of leave the original series as its own podcast and maybe change the name and do a whole different podcast for the revival instead of I don't know. I'm still toying with that idea, but yeah, the original one only has the 2 seasons. Right.
Okay. Oh, well, as I say, I suppose it's a goal in mind, isn't it? As well, that you can finish that off, and then you've got a package full of stuff. What about podcasts that you enjoy? Then, have you ever, as likes of the Twilight Zone one, have you ever been asked to be approached to go onto his podcast or anything like that at all?
Yeah, actually, well, I wasn't approached to go on the Twilight Zone podcast proper. He had a Patreon, and I joined the Patreon, and so he has this other show where he talks about the 80s Twilight Zone called Twilight Zone Aftermath, and he had an open invite to patrons, if you want, kind of just raise your hand and we'll set something up. And so I said I would love to, because I told him before how much his podcast meant to me and everything, and how we became good friends after the early years and stuff. And then that's one thing that I wasn't ready for either. Speaking of intimidation, I'm going on it's kind of I think my exact words were how do you open for Sinatra? I told him, and he started laughing because it's his show is such a high quality, and I feel like I just kind of, it was kind of what you said, where you're oh crap, I haven't seen that show in years. I gotta watch it real quick and kind of hopefully make sense. And then So we did it, and it was great. He said it was good, but I refuse to listen back to it because I don't. I think like I just am a mess in that episode. Too much nerves, you know.
Yeah.
So
but it's I suppose it's all kind of you know, a way of building confidence up, though, isn't it? I mean, as I say, you're into your 19th, your 20th episode now, and the fact that, you know, you that was going to be my final question actually about this. So you're into these 19, 20 episodes. Have you had any feedback from anyone on how the podcast has been going and if it and how it's reached out to people? Have you had much feedback from your show?
I actually have, and then that's been the best part of this, because like I said, when I first started, I just figured I go into each show figuring like nobody's listening. You know, I because I'm on Tom's site, he sees all the numbers. I refuse to even think about that. So to this day, I have no idea how many people or how many downloads I get. I'd rather be in the dark in my own little bubble of just content. You know, there's no pressure. If you assume nobody listens, it's good. But I get emails, and it's people saying like, "Hey, you're doing a good job, man. Don't quit," or a few people saying that, sharing their memories, and I've had people even like send in audio clips, and it's very rewarding. It makes you feel like if you're ever like doubting, you know, if you should do the show or not, and it's great to hear that people are listening and they enjoy what you're doing and that your hard work is paying off. So that's the best part of it. It's like that's its own pay. People always say, "Do you get paid to podcasting?" No, man, it's of course not. But the pay is in the satisfaction that people are listening, and they actually care and like what you're doing. So that's been pretty cool.
Well, I think that's a perfect time to wrap this episode up. Thank you very much for coming on, Victor. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to speak to you. It's one of those things where, you know, again, The Outer Limits, the 90s TV show, was something I did watch and I do want to go back to, but I am finding a bit of a renaissance with myself, with Star Trek, for example. I've, as much as I hate to say this, I haven't seen all the original series of Star Trek. I'm very much a Next Generation onwards person, and I've seen episodes, and even on my current rewatch, I've watched like the first 15 episodes of season 1, and I was actually really surprised how many I actually have seen. But there are episodes I haven't seen. And I think this is the same with The Outer Limits. It's, you know, I wouldn't have really looked at maybe going into it. And if I do go into it, and when I do eventually decide to do that, I think your podcast is definitely something that I'll be listening to. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Where can people find the podcast, and where can people find you online?
You can find the podcast on Twitter at Outer Limits Pod, and I'm on Twitter at The Outer Limits Podcast. My personal Twitter is at The Mighty Zero, but it's just me like retweeting a bunch of random memes and talking about Japanese professional wrestling or something, you know?
That's fine. And talking about your dogs and
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well, luckily there's been no dogs barking tonight, so that's been fantastic. But
thankfully, Joser.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, thank you very much for coming on. You can find myself on obviously this podcast, which is at Pick Up a Podcast, and I'm also on the Make It So podcast, a podcast about Star Trek Picard that we're currently going through. As the time of recording, we're moving up to episode 6, and we should be nearing the season end by the time this episode airs. By the time that this Pick Up a Podcast airs, so that should be great. You can also find me on the Millennium podcast. That will be coming back in April. We mentioned Millennium today. I hope that you do get to listen to our coverage of Millennium on there, and that's at the Time Is Now pod. And also just remember that we are on the We Made This podcast network as well.
Previously on the We Made This network. Observing the Pattern, a Fringe podcast.
You're going to meet someone who's quite important now, and this is where we're going. So I think you're definitely right, and it then it pushes the other episodes, like what's to come, like Bound and Safe, and those episodes, and even Transformation, which we're going to be on in a few episodes' time. It pushes that kind of serialization, which wasn't really there before. There's hints at it, but you know, there is definitely some sort of change that's happening, and this is the beginning of it.
We Buy Records.
Fury Dub's most treasured record is an original UK pressing of Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland. Do you know this one, Paul? Do you know
No.
the cover? I think it has
Yeah, I looked it up yesterday when I was doing research. It's got naked ladies on it, Timmy.
It's got lots and lots and lots of naked ladies on it. Now, I didn't know this, but apparently Jimi Hendrix didn't like that cover, and so it was changed, which is one of the things that makes that original really rare. Maybe he was a hashtag SJW in his day. That would be
Who
nice,
knows?
wouldn't it?
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast.
See, that's the thing. That's the one thing that kind of bothers me about this episode is that Mulder is almost... He starts off a little too much. You know what I mean? And I feel like he's playing a little hard on this scene. I think if maybe he backed off just a tiny bit, it would have been more of a progression towards madness. But he almost seems a little mad already, but in a different way, in a different sense.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.
Pick Up a Podcast is created and hosted by Kurt North and is part of the We Made This podcast network. It can be found on Twitter at PickUpAPodcast. Music for the show is created by David Kennedy and produced by David Kennedy, Kurt North and Ian Curtin. Check out the We Made This podcast network on Twitter at We Made This Pod and on Facebook by searching We Made This. There is also a website. Check that out at www.wemadethispod.com. Thanks for listening.